Our first lesson. Now we've been studying in Mark, the first 8 chapters of Mark. The last quarterly was, and it looks like this quarterly is going to finish up the rest of the study in Mark there. The title of our lesson is The Transfiguration of Jesus. That's a big word there. Transfiguration. Transfigured is a past tense of transfigure, and it means changed in form or appearance. That's what the word means. And I was trying to think this morning, when we get saved, are we transfigured? Are we transfigured when we get saved? How would you answer that?
Well, we're translated from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of His dear Son.
Okay. Translated. Okay, which is a root word of transfigure. And our actions, but see, this is not its form and appearance, Well, I tried to think, well, our actions are different,
sure.
But is that transfigured? Does the actions include, is it included in transfigured? It's mainly form and appearance is what it is.
Yes.
Okay. Well, our appearance is sometimes changed. Brother Bayless was going like this, most generally people are not very happy when they're not a Christian. What'd you say? We're a new creation. We sure are. And, we sometimes dress different. We sometimes talk different. Of course, that's actions again, But what we are studying here is Christ was changed in His bodily form. But yet He was recognized by the disciples that seen this happen. There was also 2 other men that appeared, and the disciples recognized them other 2 men. These men had been gone several hundreds of years, but yet they recognized them. Now, how is that possible? I don't know. I really don't know. But they knew what these men stood for, and you can conjure up a image of someone. You can. Somebody might mention a name to you, and immediately, or it does to me anyway, immediately I put a picture of that person in my mind, right or wrong. I put a picture on, and then as you talk with the person, maybe he don't look or she don't look like that after all, and you kind of reform, and one thing and another. But these guys knew who they were. Right. And so let's get into this then, and let's see what we can find out here. Let's look at the memory verse there. It's going to appear here a little later in our lesson there. But Mark 9:7. And there was a cloud that overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear Him." Okay, I'm not going to say a whole lot about right at this time about the memory verse, but think on that. It's a very good verse there, and all. I'm going to read a junior emphasis, which you won't find in your quarterly there, but I'm going to read the junior emphasis. You have an adult, and it's a lot like it, but we're going to read it anyway. By a miracle, Jesus was transfigured. His appearance was wonderfully changed Jesus was fulfilling the Old Testament law. Jesus was fulfilling the prophecies. After death, Moses and Elias, and that's who we're going to be talking about, Elias, which is Elijah, which might be more familiar in the Old Testament. Am I saying that right? Elijah?
Yeah, well, Elias is the Greek Elijah.
Okay.
In Greek, there's no J sound.
Okay.
Elias.
Okay. And so these two men was with Jesus, Moses and Elijah, or Elias as it says, were alive again and knew what was happening. They actually knew what was going on. Moses and Elijah did. Okay? Jesus is God's Son. Jesus is the one we should hear and obey. Jesus knew all about His coming death and resurrection. Jesus already knew that. Don't you remember? He told the disciples what was going to happen. What was pretty much the last verse, or the last few verses of our lesson, last Sunday. Remember, Jesus said that they was going to kill Him, and then Peter rebuked Him. You remember that when we were studying that? Well, Peter was rebuked himself because of him rebuking Jesus, because what Jesus was saying was true, and Peter had no idea that what all was going to take place. And so this is what had happened right before. Also, what happened right before in chapter 8 was the one that we studied last week. Do you remember? Jesus asked the disciples, whom do men say I am? And they gave some examples. And then He says, whom do you say that I am? And that's when Peter spoke up and said, thou art the Christ, if you remember studying that. Okay, now we're going into chapter 9 and the second verse, and it says, and after 6 days, Jesus taketh with Him Peter and James and John. That was His 3 closest disciples, Peter, James, and John. 2 of them was brothers, which was John and James. They were brothers. And Peter then was kind of a partner to these 2 men in the fishing business. But they were all called pretty much at the same time to be Jesus' disciples. I don't know if any of these were John's disciples. I don't believe they were they? Okay, that's what I was thinking.
You mean John the Baptist?
John the Baptist, yeah.
James and John were disciples of John the Baptist.
Oh, they were? Okay, all right. But anyway, that's who He takes. Takes Peter, James, and John, leads them up into a high mountain apart by themselves, and He was transfigured before them. Transfigured now, remember His appearance and His form was changed at this time. And His raiment became shining, exceeding white as snow, so as no fuller on earth can white them. What's a fuller? Somebody does cleaning, isn't it? You've heard of Fuller's soap, haven't you? If you haven't, it's a strong soap that makes things real white, is what it is. And that's what He's talking about, real white. And there appeared unto them Elias with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And again, Elias is Elijah. And so here we have a setting here of what is taking place at this time. And He takes the 3 disciples, Jesus takes the 3 disciples, and they go up on a mountain. And they this would be a very striking moment of your life if this would happen. You know, when this happened to them, I believe it left an impression on their minds that they never ever forgot about. Moses They knew who Moses was, but only through history that they knew who really Moses and Elijah was. Moses was always looked to as the father of the law, is what he looked, what people looked to him as. Why? Because that was the man that God gave the law to. If we will remember, in Exodus we got the 10 Commandments and the different laws that wasn't the only laws that God gave Moses on that mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. It wasn't just the 10 Commandments and that was it. There was lots and lots and lots and lots, and I can go on forever, of laws that Moses had to relay when he relayed to the children of Israel when he came down off of that mountain then. And the big responsibility was, I've got to relay this to the family of Aaron, because Aaron was the chosen family for the priesthood. And so everything had to be relayed to Aaron and his offsprings then, so that they could get it right. If they didn't get it right, what was going to happen? They wouldn't be worshiping God the way God wanted them to worship Him. It was all and you know, when God told them, and He says, keep my commandments, and how many times did He say that after Moses was up on Mount Sinai and brought the law back? How many times did He tell the children of Israel, keep my commandments and I will be your God and you will be my people? How many times did He say that? So many times that we can't hardly number it, you know. That was the important thing to God, was to keep His commandments, you know. And so that's the reason why Moses was one of the 3 people up here that was being transfigured, was because of him being the lawgiver. Okay, now why was Elijah chosen? Why do you think Elijah was chosen to be part of this 3 that was up there?
Here's the first significant prophet to Israel.
Okay, did you hear that? The first significant prophet of it for Israel. And now remember, Christ was prophesied of. You know, the law was given, and the law and the prophets was always mentioned together, it seems like, the law and the prophets. Christ was prophesied. His coming was prophesied. Who all prophesied of Jesus, that Jesus was going to come? Did Elijah prophesy that Jesus was going to come? I'm getting head shaking yes. Did Isaiah prophesy Jesus coming? Very much so, quite a little bit of. Did Joel prophesy of His coming? I think so. I'm not for sure, but I think so. Did Malachi prophesy? Yes, he did. What about Jeremiah? You know, there's a whole group of prophets that prophesied, and you know, these all didn't live at one time. You know, they didn't live at, you know, from 900 BC to 800 BC, and then that was it. No, they were scattered all along through there, because there was people being born in the 1000, you know, BC. There was people being born in 900 BC. There was people being born in 800 BC. And the prophets was for that generation, see? And so, you know, that's what he was talking about. But as Brother Bayless said, Elijah was this first significant prophet of Israel. And so that's where it all kind of hinges on, is on him, and also on the law, very much on the law, you know. And so, here, this was a big happening it was a happening to where the disciples, it caught their eye. They were very much into this. They, this this is something here that, and they probably thought, man, there's 9 other disciples down there that's not getting to witness this. We're going to have to be awake. We're going to have to know what's going on. We're going to have, so that we can tell these other disciples. Don't you think that went through their minds? We're you might say kind of the lucky 3 that got to come. Well, no, it was God chose those 3 is what it was. They went up that mountain, and as Jesus prayed, he was transfigured. As he prayed, he was transfigured. His face and his clothing was changed. His face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light. White as it could be. We see new fallen snow, and it's just as white as it can be. After it's been there a little while, especially if it drifted, after it starts melting, boy, it gets nasty looking. Snow really does. But as it's falling, everything's just white. You know what? Christ was even whiter than that. Now, how's that possible? I don't know, but anyway, it was whiter than that. How beautiful. Could any mere man look like that? No way. The disciples looked, and they saw 2 men talking with Jesus, Moses and Elijah. This was all a big, wonderful miracle. Because Moses had died more than 1,400 years earlier. 1,400 years earlier. Well, people that's died 1,400 years, we think there's not much left to them, but, yes, his body, there probably wasn't much left to his body, his earthly body. But God gave him a body here that was recognizable by these disciples. Elijah was taken up into heaven by a whirlwind nearly 900 years before this happening here. So see, did Elijah ever see Moses? Well, there's 500 years between the two. I don't think they did. I don't think Elijah even knew who Moses was, as far as being around him. He knew who Moses was, though, Elijah did, because Moses was the one that got the law from God. And so Elijah followed the law of God and prophesied as God gave him the prophecies. He was in tune with God, just as Moses was in tune with God when Moses was alive, just as Jesus was in tune with God while Jesus was here on earth. They were all in tune with God, and 2 of them had already passed on, and so Jesus was there living now, which Jesus lived at that time too, but here now Jesus brought them back from heaven to tell them about how he would die to save people from sin. Do you think that's what they were communing about? We can suspect a lot of things, but that was probably it. Moses, you brought the law. You had the law. God gave you the law. You relayed it to the people of God. Elijah, you prophesied to me. Now you get to see me right now. He said, you get to see me. This was what everything was hinged on, was the voice of God. The Word of God is what all this was hinged on here. Moses and Elijah were very interested. They had worked for God long ago. God had given His law to the people through Moses. Now Jesus was fulfilling the law and making a way for people to really keep the law. Did they keep the law back then? They tried to. They tried to keep the law, but there were so many laws and all that they would miss some, they would give up on some, and one thing and another. But this way, this is how, is what's coming now, is a way that God has set for us to be able to live the life that He wants us to live, and to live after the commandments of Him. God had given Elijah many prophecies. Now Jesus was fulfilling the prophecies. That was taking place now. This is the time. Did they know what year it was? That it was 0 year, you know, you might say. It was AD Christ now, because what, about 30 some years now. Did they know that? Well, yeah, I'm sure they probably did know that, but they knew that what they had prophesied of, and the law that Moses had given, that here was the answer to it all. Do you remember Abraham? Do you remember Abraham? He looked ahead toward Christ. And Abraham was before Moses even. And how he looked ahead and saw, could understand a little glimpse of what he was looking for, and that was for Christ. Moses and Elijah had been sad to see the people sinning. That was during their lifetime. They were happy now to know that Jesus was making the way to save sinners. We too should be happy that Jesus came. Moses and Elijah were alive again. They died here on earth. Remember, Moses died. Wasn't he on a mountain when he died? He was looking over into the okay, and then I think he was buried in the valley. I believe was, and no, God buried him, but I think it mentioned in the valley, I believe. But anyway, God took care of him. We have no idea where Moses was buried. Elijah, where's his sepulcher at? There's none, because he went up in a whirlwind, you know. But they knew Jesus. They understood what he was telling them. The disciples saw and heard it. And what did they learn? Well, let's go here. Mark 9 and 5. And Peter answered and said to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here. And let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Doesn't that sound wonderful? Wow. That just sounds, that, you know, I think I would fall in the same rut that Peter fell. Man, this is wonderful. You know, here's Moses and Elijah and Jesus and a tabernacle for all 3 of them, you know. Man, well, let's see. For he wist not what he said. For Brother Larry wist not what he'd said, you know. For they were sore afraid. They were afraid. They were exceedingly afraid here. And verse 7, and there was a cloud that overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my beloved Son, hear him. Moses has already, in other words, this voice here, Moses has already served his purpose. He brought the law, and he served his purpose. We don't need a tabernacle for Moses anymore. Elijah has already served his purpose. He prophesied of Jesus. And all the prophecies that it was. So we don't need a tabernacle for Elijah. But Jesus here is the answer to all our problems. Right. Jesus here has got everything for what we need. He is the answer for everything that we need. Here's Jesus. Had they heard this before? This is my beloved Son, hear Him, or follow Him, or anything like that? Had they ever heard that before? If you'll remember back when Jesus' baptism, what happened there? Basically, a lot the same thing happened here. It came down as a dove and lit on Him and said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." Again, it says here at the Transfiguration, "This is my beloved Son. Hear Him." Hear Him. Peter, we think, well, Peter, had a good idea, but that idea was not so good after you understand what was going on here. His idea, at the surface, man, it just seems like that was wonderful what Peter thought of. But then, oh, yeah, the law and the prophets has already come. And now Christ hadn't died yet, but it was just right around the corner. It wasn't going to be long after this that Jesus died, was buried, rose again, and in 50 days he was going to go back into heaven. And that is the answer to all that Moses and the prophets, Elijah and the prophets and all was looking forward to. Abraham was even looking forward to that day. And so, this is what he was talking about. Again, I say Peter's thinking was wonderful on the surface, but it was not what Jesus wanted. God's answer was, a cloud came down close. A cloud spoke from it. "This is my beloved Son, hear Him." Do what He says. How many people rejected Jesus when He was here? It seemed like all the religious uppity-ups all rejected Him, it seems like. You take the Pharisees, that's the ones I have reference to as being the uppity-ups. They was always against what Jesus had or was telling them. They were always against it. Even set up false witnesses against Him, false accusations against Him. And if they could have been up there and seen that, "This is my beloved Son, hear ye Him," would they have listened? Probably not, because they were so set in their old-fashioned ways. Not saying that old-fashioned is not good, but this time was changing. This was coming from the old dispensation of time into the new dispensation of time, where sacrifices was required before Christ died. They were required and put on the people, and it was the right thing to do. But now, since Christ has died, if we offer sacrifices just like they did in the Old Testament, we would be so wrong, because we have a better way. Christ is the sacrifice that was given, and we are to look to Him. It is not good to speak without thinking. And I think that's kind of what Peter did. It is not good to speak without thinking. And we see Peter do that a few times. And, we pick on Peter, and all. But, sometimes I'm the same way. I'll admit, I'm the same way. Sometimes I have to back off and say, wait a minute now. What I'm getting ready to say, is that the right thing to say? And I have to do that sometimes. Peter learns this later on. We might even study some of what he does then afterwards. But Peter, if we just look ahead in the book of Acts, and where Peter makes different statements, and one thing, he's the one that preached on the day of Pentecost, And I think he he thought about what was going on before he spoke then. But before, he blurted out just like that, and we have to be very careful. It's not good to speak without thinking. It's not good to choose our own way. We must listen to Jesus and do as he says always. Always. The church must do as he says, because he is God's Son. He is the head of the church. He is the only begotten Son of Christ, of God. Christ is the only begotten Son of God. The only Son. And so, when God made the statement, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased," or "This is my beloved Son, hear ye him," and it's basically the same thing as what God was saying. I recognize him as my only begotten Son, and he's the one that you are to follow now, because he's the way. He's the way. He's the truth. He's the life, but God does not go into all of that, but it's all the same. It's all the same. Now, Christ has done his work, and it's up to us whether we're going to accept that work that he has done. God had promised to send a prophet whom the people were to hear, and Jesus is that prophet. I'm going to read a verse that's not in your lesson there, Deuteronomy 18:15. And this was way back in the Old Testament time. This was when Moses was still yet alive. And so this was 1400 years before now, in other words. "The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet," and that prophet's capitalized there, "from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me, unto him ye shall hearken."
That's right.
And he's prophesying of Jesus right there. That verse, I've read over that verse. I know I've read it several times, but it was printed in my teacher's lesson here, teacher's quarterly. And I read that and I thought, boy, that just brought it right out to where we that have already are on the other side of the New Testament can really see that, Now them back then in the Old Testament, no, they couldn't see. They didn't know what was going on. They read that, and it was kind of like me when I read over it, oh yes, but I still could understand it better than they could, even at that, And yet we can be so thankful that we live on this side of the dispensation of time, because we can look at these things and realize this has already taken place, All we got to do is believe it. See, Moses didn't know when he was living on earth. Moses didn't know he was going to be translated 1400 years after he dies. And Elijah didn't either, They didn't know that. But, as it come, and that's the same way with us out into the future. We don't know what we're going to face into the future. But we have Christ, and Christ is there ready to lead us. He's ready to make intercession for us with the Holy Spirit leading us, that we can do each and every day what we're required to do. And oh, by the way, that last verse that I read was our memory verse. So now, hopefully you can understand that now, if you didn't before, and all. Now let's go to verse 8. "And suddenly, when they had looked round about, they saw no man any more save Jesus only with themselves." Four people on the mountain. 3 disciples and Jesus only. Now, at one time there was 6 people. There was six on the mountain. Okay, what happened to Moses and Elijah? They were taken back up. They were brought down to show I think mainly they were brought down to show these three disciples prophecy is being fulfilled right now. Jesus knew it. Moses knew it. Elijah knew it. And I think these three disciples needed that.
Sure.
They needed that. Yeah.
Like we've been studying in our Sunday morning messages, there's a definite change in dispensation about to take place.
Mm-hmm.
Moses and Elijah, the law and prophets, will be in the past, and now it's going to be Jesus. Old Testament to New Testament.
Uh-huh. And God was the one. They recognized that was God's voice that said, "This is my beloved Son, hear ye him," or "hear him." I think in one place it says, "Hear ye him," maybe in Matthew or somewhere. But anyway, hear him.
That's right.
You listen to him, you know. And yes, Moses served his purpose, Elijah served his, and now here's where we're at now. And suddenly when they had looked around about, they saw no man anymore save Jesus, only with themselves. And as they came down from the mountain, he charged them that they should tell no man what things they had seen till the Son of Man were risen from the dead. And they kept that saying with themselves, questioning one with another what the rising from the dead should mean. They still did not understand that. We can understand it because Jesus was put in the grave, and you know how the soldiers guarded that grave, you know, that sepulcher. And one Sunday morning, that was the first day of the week, that grave busted open. Well, it didn't bust open, but the stone was moved away, and that stone couldn't keep Jesus in the grave, and Jesus rose. Because how do we know that? Well, Mary told us about that. Mary Magdalene told us about that. And, you know, witnesses afterwards saw him. 500 people at one time saw him, and different ones. There was different ones seen him. That's how we know he was raised from the dead. His raising would be the greatest proof of his deity.
That's right.
His raising. Now, I'm not talking about Mary and Joseph raising him as a child. I'm talking about raising from the dead is what I'm talking about. It is the greatest proof of his deity. As they come down from the mountain, Jesus charged them to tell no man what things they had seen until they saw the Son of Man risen from the dead. What's he talking about? What's he talking about? These three guys probably got together several times when they were by themselves. Now, I don't understand what Jesus is talking about here, you know, raising from the dead. But we can't say anything because he's charged us not to say anything. And remember, God said, do what he says.
Right.
Hear him, do what he says. So we better keep this to ourselves, you know. And don't you think that was hard to keep to yourself?
Yeah.
Hey, Thomas, I'd sure like to tell you something, but I can't tell you until something happens. I don't know what it is, you know. Or Nathaniel, we got something, you know. You know, it's hard to keep a secret sometimes when it's big like this. But that's what Jesus said. They would not understand it until after he arose from the dead. Nevertheless, Jesus knew what would happen. How did he know? Because he's God. That's how he knew. He planned to die and rise again to save people. He knows all things. The one who was going to die was the same one they had just seen in this beautiful, shining, heavenly glory. This almighty, loving, sinless Son of God would let himself, would allow, was not forced to be nailed to the cross for us to take our punishment. He was not forced to the cross. Christ was not forced to the cross. He was led to the cross, and he took it willingly. My. Just... it's just wonderful how Christ loved us so much that he allowed this to be done.
Amen.
He humbled himself to this. The subject talked about was Christ's death. By his perfect offering for sin, Jesus entered upon his mediator role between God and man. Through his death, he brought the new salvation toward which the law and the prophets had pointed to. That's what he was fulfilling. They were now yielding up to him the authority they had carried for a time. That was the two that was up there. The voice of God named Jesus his son as the one to be heard and obeyed. And the disciples, in wishing to detain Moses and Elijah, they would like to have been able to keep them, had unwittingly presented the symbol of giving equal place to the law. And see, we can't give equal place to the law, because the law's been fulfilled.
That's right.
And we have a greater way now. The prophets and the gospel, it must not be so. Jesus is the way, the truth, the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by him. And here's a verse I'm going to read to you, Luke 16:16. The law and the prophets were until John. Since that time the kingdom of God is preached, and every man presseth into it. Okay. Mark 9:11. And they asked him, saying, why say the scribes that Elijah must first come? And he answered and told them, Elijah verily come first, and restoreth all things. And now it is written of the Son of Man, that he might suffer many things, and be set at naught. And I say unto you that Elijah is indeed come, and they have done unto him whatsoever they listed, as it is written of him. Here was a question that the disciples had. They remembered reading this in the Bible. In Malachi is where it's recorded. And it says, I will send you here it is, Malachi 4:5. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Who's he talking about here? You know, they asked Jesus who people thought he was. Some of them thought he was John the Baptist. Some of them thought he was Elijah. Some of them thought he was Isaiah. Some of them thought he was Jeremiah. Some of them thought he was all kinds of prophets, you know. But who he's talking about here is John the Baptist. The forerunner of Christ is who he was talking about here. The disciples was a little bit confused on this. I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. This was the day of the Lord. Was this visit of Elijah what God had meant? They asked Jesus. What was the answer? No. God had meant he would send John the Baptist. John had come in the spirit and power of Elijah, is what he had done. Sinful people had done to him whatsoever they listed. So would they do to the Son of Man, or the Son of God, Jesus? Would that be what they would do to him? Yeah, we already have have seen the rest of the story. We've already read the rest of the story. And yes, we understand that was what was going to happen. It was written in the prophecy that he must suffer. And if you want to look at the suffering of Christ, that you can find in Isaiah 53. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid as it were our faces from him. He was despised, and he esteemed him not. And so on. Now you know the portion of the scripture that I'm reading there. But that's in Isaiah 53, 3 through 8. I won't read all of it, but you know, it tells how he bore the griefs and how he was led like a sheep to the slaughter. And how he was bruised for our iniquities, wounded for our transgression. That's kind of a summary of what you would read. But that was talking about Jesus. Isaiah was talking about Jesus. This was 700, 800 years before Jesus even was born. And yet, Isaiah could see that. He wasn't sure probably of what all was taking place here, but he knew that there was going to be a better way. And so that's what he was talking about. Let's go on to Matthew 9 and 14. And when he had come to his disciples, he saw a great multitude about them, and the scribes questioned with him. And straightway all the people... Did I skip one? No, And straightway all the people, when they beheld him, were greatly amazed, and running to him saluted him. And he asked the scribes, What question ye with thee? And one of the multitudes answered and said, Master, I have brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit. And wheresoever he taketh him, he teareth him, and he foameth, and he gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth away. And I spake to thy disciples that they should cast him out, and they could not. Now he's talking about the other 9 disciples that were left, is what he was talking about. He brought him to the disciples. The disciples couldn't cast the dumb spirit out. What is a dumb spirit? It's a spirit that keeps a person from talking, right? Keeps him from talking. That's what it was. You know, we use the word dumb different ways, but this is what he's talking about. A dumb spirit couldn't talk. Let's go into verse 19. He answered him and said, O faithless, this is Jesus talking here, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him unto me. And they brought him unto him, and when he saw him, straightway the spirit tare him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed foaming. So, you know, this spirit had a real hold on this poor child here. And Jesus asked his father, how long is it ago since this came upon him? And he said, of a child. Ever since he was a child, this is what has happened. And oft times he have cast him into the fire, this spirit. We cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. But if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Help us. Jesus said unto him, if thou canst believe, if you can only believe, all things are possible to him that believeth. And straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, listen to what he says here. Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. You know, if we don't believe something, God can help us in our unbelief. God is there ready. You know, this guy didn't just jump out and say, I believe, and then go on. But he says, help thou my unbelief. When Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the foul spirit, saying unto him, thou dumb and deaf spirit. Now Jesus added another spirit on here, which was deaf, which was one you can't, the person couldn't hear. But he added that to it. So in that respect, he couldn't hear, he couldn't speak. Thou dumb and deaf spirit, I charge thee, come out of him and enter no more into him. And the spirit cried and rent him sore, and came out of him, and he was as one dead, insomuch that many said, he is dead. But what does Jesus do? But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. When we, as a sinner, come to Christ, we come and we die to ourself. And you know, this was kind of this reminded me of how I was when I was a sinner. I did not have control over myself. I didn't have control over what I say and what I hear, what I do. You know, temptation always came upon me. But you know, when Christ dealt with me, that all changed. Everything changed. We become a servant of Christ. We became a vessel of Christ that we can do the work that needs to be done in us. And you know, sometimes we might think, believing this or believing that, it's hard to believe. But you know, we can be just like this father of this child. Lord, help my unbelief. Is it wrong not to believe? Well, if we continue in that respect, not to believe in God, then yes, we're gonna have problems. How can we be saved from our sins if we can't believe in Jesus Christ? It's impossible. It's impossible. Sometimes we might need that prayer. Help my unbelief. Help me in what I needed to do. Help me to be able to accomplish what God has for me to do. And when he was coming to the house, his disciple asked him privately, why could not we cast him out? And he said unto them, this kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting. Two little ammunitions right there. Prayer and fasting. We definitely need prayer. We have to have prayer. We have to have fasting. You know, sometimes fasting is required of us. And sometimes we get to a point where we have to fast. We have to fast. Or otherwise this is not going to... Is that the reason why these other 9 disciples could not cast that out, you know? That could be. So we can just take that for what Jesus said. Our next lessons is more principles of the kingdom. I think we had a couple of lessons of that in our last lesson, but there's still more principles of the kingdom. So let's come back next Sunday and see what the Lord has for us saying.